Shiraishi is an invisible loser who is ignored by all his classmates. However, his life begins to change when the school baddie makes it her mission to turn him into a Rize lord. Shiraishi was seated in class browsing through his phone on ways to be the perfect background character when Kubo came up to him. When she noticed his phone, she took a picture, and Shiraishi begged her to delete it, but Kubo refused. While the class was going on, Kubo dared him to stand on his desk so they could test just how invisible he was. Shiraishi said he wasn't interested, but the sneaky girl threatened to show the picture she took to everyone. So he had no choice but to do the dare, and almost immediately, the teacher told him to sit back down. When the class was over, Kubo congratulated him for being the main character, and Shiraishi congratulated her for being the perfect reincarnation of Maleficent. Kubo told him to lighten up and promised to be nice to him going forward. The next day, Kubo suddenly stood before Shiraishi in the class. When he asked what the matter was, she didn't respond and kept looking at him. The clueless boy had no idea what he had done wrong and told Kubo he wasn't the Martian manhunter who could read minds. Kubo said since he couldn't remember what he did wrong, she had to punish him, so she boldly sat between his legs, surprising him. Luckily for him, no one noticed their inappropriate position, but Shiraishi couldn't believe he had the hottest girl in school warming his sausage. When she got up, she told him to make sure he responded to people's greetings, which made him realize she was angry because he ignored her greetings in the morning. Later during class, the teacher asked Kubo a question, but she said she didn't know the answer. However, she told the teacher Shiraishi knew the answer even though he had no idea what was going on. When he stood up to answer, Kubo pointed out the answer in her notebook, so he didn't disgrace himself. When class was over, Kubo asked Shiraishi for his pine contact, but they were interrupted by her friends. Later that day, she noticed Shiraishi sitting on a bench in the park and approached him. While they were talking, she took a picture of him, but it came out blurry. She then suggested they take a selfie so they could have a better chance at capturing his face. After taking the picture, Kubo suggested they should hang out some other time and asked for his pine contact. Shiraishi was hesitant but gave it to her before asking what she planned to do to him next, causing her to laugh in response and promise to go easy on him, making him wonder if it was raining good luck. That night, she sent him the picture they took together and asked him to hang out with her, which he agreed to do. As Kubo passed by her sister in the hallway, she didn't notice Akina's usual teasing because she was so excited after reading his response. The next day at school during gym class, Shiraishi had to call out to his partner to make sure he knew where he was while running. After the class, while breathing like a lazy horse despite only running a single lap, Kubo approached him. Shiraishi moved back so quickly that it was as if he floated away, making Kubo ask what the problem was. He admitted he smelt like an overused gym sock, so he didn't want her to have to deal with his instant death body odor. Kubo then closed the gap between them and sniffed him before saying she didn't have a problem with his smell. Shiraishi moved again because her closeness had his heart running 5 miles per hour, so Kubo told him to wait for her and went back to the classroom. When he was alone, Shiraishi couldn't help but think how nice she looked with her hair in a ponytail and wondered if he'd finally become a main character if he changed his hairstyle. Kubo soon returned and pressed a scented towel to his cheek, causing him to jump in surprise. He took the towel and cleaned his body but noticed Kubo looking at him weirdly. He asked why she was staring at him like he was the latest iPhone, and she admitted she liked that they smelled the same now. Later in the day, Kubo noticed Shiraishi trying and failing to get the automatic doors at the bookstore to open for him. It wasn't until he stopped moving around that the slow brain boy realized it wasn't the sensor type, but the push-button type. Kubo could not watch him embarrass himself further, so she went to help him open the door. Inside the store, she asked what he wanted to buy, and he told her it was the newest volume of his favorite manga. Kubo became intrigued and said she'd buy the first volumes to read, however, the store didn't have them. So Shiraishi promised to bring them to school the next day. When they came out of the store, they discovered their houses were in the same neighborhood, so Kubo said she'd stop at his place to get the manga instead. After he handed the manga to her, Kubo asked what time he left for school, so he told her he left around 8 every morning. The next morning, Kubo woke up by 6:30 a.m., did her morning routine and even sprayed some of her sister's expensive hairspray on her hair. When she went down for breakfast, Akina asked if she woke up early because of a special event at school. But Kubo told her it was a normal day, which got Akina looking at her strangely. Akina stood up, and as she played with Kubo's hair, she asked if she had a crush. Kubo flatly denied it and stood to leave. making her sister tease her about running off to see her crush. Once outside, Kubo waited for Shiraishi so they could walk to school together. Because they were early, she suggested they sit on a bench outside the convenience store and wait. While they were there, Tama and Hazuki joined them, but didn't notice Shiraishi until Kubo pointed him out. Later in the day, on his way home, a car drove through a puddle and splattered mud over his clothes. Shiraishi was glad he was invisible so no one would notice his dirty clothes. But since he had rotten luck, Kubo appeared beside him. Together they walked home, and when they got to Shiraishi's house, Kubo went on her way. However, Shiraishi couldn't find his house keys, and when Kubo heard him struggling with the door, she came back. He explained what happened and texted his mother, who told him she'd be home in 2 hours. So Shiraishi decided to wash off the mud at the park, but Kubo suggested he come to her house instead. While he showered at her house, Kubo dropped off a towel and her tracksuit for him to use when he finished. When Shiraishi came out, he found Kubo, who was waiting by the door, and thanked her for helping him, while promising to return the tracksuit the next day before saying goodbye and leaving. Shiraishi had just gotten to school when he met Kubo at the staircase. He then handed her the tracksuit he had borrowed the previous day, and after Kubo took it, she asked how tall he was, which Shiraishi found strange but answered nonetheless. Kubo then stood a step above him and said that was the ideal height difference of a couple. Shiraishi pointed out that the guy was supposed to be taller, but she hushed him and said their position made her want to play his head, which she did. Kubo asked if he wished he were taller, and he said yes, so she came down before telling him she preferred their height difference, after which she walked on to class, leaving him behind. Later in class, after handing in their exam papers, Kubo tried to speak with Shiraishi, but he said he had plans and promised to talk later. When he left, her friends came to speak to her, but Kubo was distracted thinking about what sort of plans Shiraishi had. Later that day, a woman was passing by the park when she noticed a little boy building a snowman. She wondered why he was all alone and went to speak with him. As soon as she approached the boy, asking where his mother was, Shiraishi materialized out of nowhere and said he was watching over him. The woman was shocked but apologized for not noticing him. When she left, Shiraishi sat on a bench watching his brother Sita when Kubo pressed a chocolate drink to his cheek. While they stood talking, Sita noticed the drink in Kubo's hand and asked for it. His brother tried to explain that the drink belonged to Kubo, but she had no problem giving it to the little kid because she hadn't opened it. After taking a sip, Sita insisted Kubo take one too, which she did, so he offered it to Shiraishi. He tried to refuse, but when he saw his brother's puppy dog eyes, he took the drink and pretended to take a sip. Sita went back to play happily, and Kubo teased Shiraishi, saying he didn't take a sip because he was too scared to have his first kiss indirectly. Later that day, Shiraishi went to a bookstore to buy a manga magazine, but due to his lack of presence, no one noticed him trying to pick up a magazine. He decided to stop trying and wait till all the patrons left so he could get what he came for. When they finally left, he went to pick up his manga, but came across an adult magazine. Shiraishi's first thought was to put it back in its rightful place, but he realized that his invisibility was the perfect cover he needed to peep into the magazine. However, before he could fulfill the lifelong dream of seeing plots without armor, Akina approached him. She told him he was still a diaper-wearing kid, so he had no business reading such things, but Shiraishi quickly hid the magazine and said someone had left it lying around after flipping through it, so he wanted to put it back. However, his heart was beating like crazy as he hoped she wouldn't see through his lies. She accepted his excuse, even though she knew he was lying, and as Shiraishi wondered how she'd been able to notice him, he saw her name tag. He then concluded that those who bore the same name as Kubo were the only ones who could notice him. After he paid for his magazine and left, Akina noticed his ID card on the floor. When she got home that night, she gave it to Kubo and asked her to return it. Kubo was surprised to see the ID belonged to Shiraishi, and when Akina told her that he'd been reading a dirty magazine with a big melon girl on the cover, she couldn't help but feel worried. The next day at school, before handing over his ID, Kubo told him her sister had picked it up at a bookstore and asked if he preferred girls with bigger plots. Shiraishi was so shocked as he wondered if she'd seen it at the store, but when he remembered what she said, he concluded her sister was in the store. He then panicked, thinking Kubo believed he was some sort of shut-in virgin who spent his time reading adult magazines. However, Kubo said nothing and gave him his ID before leaving him to drown in his embarrassment. Sometime before their Christmas break, Kubo asked Shiraishi to hang out with her on Christmas Day since he had nothing planned. On Christmas Day, he arrived 30 minutes before their appointed time and decided to kill some time by walking around. When he got tired and sat down, a shoujo reject couple didn't notice him and almost sat on him, so he quickly ran off and went to wait somewhere else until Kobo arrived. She soon arrived and apologized for making him wait, but Shiraishi tried to pretend like he just arrived. Kobo didn't buy his lie and took his hand in hers before commenting on how cold it was, so he had no choice but to admit he'd been waiting for close to 30 minutes. Kobo said nothing and handed him a present instead, making this simple-minded idiot ask why she'd given it to him. Kobo told him it was a Christmas present, saying she wanted them to do a gift exchange. Shiraishi admitted he didn't get anything for her, so she gave him 30 minutes to find a suitable present. He walked around the mall for a while looking for something suitable to give her, but he couldn't find anything, and as he thought of her waiting for him in the cold, he suddenly got an idea for a gift. When he returned, he apologized for being late and handed her a pair of mittens. Kobo was so pleased with the gift that she admitted her gift to him was a stupid one which was meant to draw attention to him because it was a yellow t-shirt with the words "main character" on it. Shiraishi assured her that he didn't mind the gift because it was the thought that mattered, and the two walked off together. Sometime later, Shiraishi and Siddhup were playing in the park, when he heard a sound only to turn around to find Kubo holding her phone smiling, because she just made a video of him playing with his little brother. She apologized for disturbing them and asked them to carry on, but Shiraishi was too embarrassed to do so. The next day, while Shiraishi was thanking his stars that no one had noticed his mismatched socks, Kubo and her friends walked into the classroom talking about Valentine's Day. As Shiraishi watched them, he noticed there was something different about her but couldn't place what it was. He was so lost in thought he didn't notice Kubo standing beside him until she asked why he was watching her like a creepy stalker. Although he'd been caught red-handed, Shiraishi lied and told her he wasn't looking at her. Throughout class, he kept wondering what was wrong with her, but never got the chance to ask what it was. When class was over, Kubo asked him to help put up some printouts given to her by their teacher. She tried putting them up, but since she was short, she struggled to put them up straight. Kubo then asked Shiraishi to help her even though he was only an inch taller than her. Shiraishi took over but got scared, thinking she'd notice his socks and tease him for it, so he pulled back from the board and went to get a chair to stand on. But Kubo told him not to be ashamed of his unconventional fashion sense. She then climbed onto the chair and continued putting up the printout, giving Shiraishi the chance to observe the way she was dressed. He was surprised to see she wore tights and accidentally said it out loud. Kubo turned around and admitted her socks were wet, so she had to wear tights. She sat on the chair and pulled her legs to her chest, causing Shiraishi to wonder what the sly girl was up to. As an answer to his question, Kubo asked if her legs were bewitching because he couldn't stop staring at them, and told him his weird fetish secret was safe with her. Shiraishi denied it, saying he'd only noticed something was different about her all day, but Kubo smiled knowingly and suggested they carry on with their work. After leaving school, they went to a convenience store where Kubo had a hard time deciding what to get, which made Shiraishi think about how he and Sita always bought two different drinks and split them. As though reading his mind, Kubo suggested the same thing, but he believed she was planning something devious, so he said he'd just get a meat bun instead. Kubo then asked him to accompany her to the counter, saying he was the literal definition of behind the scenes, so if anything happened, he could swoop in and save her. Shiraishi then looked at the cuckoo in front of him and wondered if she thought he was an invisible boy. At the counter, she turned to him when the attendant asked what cup size she wanted, so Shiraishi came to her aid like a trusty sidekick and told her which to pick. On their way home from the store, Kubo asked if he wanted to take a sip of her drink, but he told her he didn't want to get her germs. Kubo then took a bite of his bun before heading home, leaving Shiraishi standing on the streets, recalling the moment until two girls bumped into him, causing him to drop it. Days later, on Valentine's Day, while all the boys in his class were hoping to get sweets and chocolates, Shiraishi didn't give two shits. He had never been given chocolates, and even when he was in elementary school, his teacher had given chocolates to everyone but him, because she didn't notice him. However, when he put his hand in his locker, he found a heart-shaped cookie, making him so surprised that he believed he was being punked. He looked around the classroom, waiting to see the cameras set up to film his humiliation, and as he wondered if someone had mistaken his locker for someone else's, Kubo appeared and asked what was wrong. Shiraishi jumped back in surprise, thinking she was a ghost, but when he realized it was her, he came back. Kubo kept looking at him, waiting for an answer, but he just brought up some lame conversation about the weather instead. After class, she asked if anyone had given him chocolates, and he said no, but when she mentioned someone put sweets in his locker, Shiraishi admitted he didn't think it was meant for him. Kubo assured him it was and told him to enjoy it before walking away. It turned out Kubo had bought some baking ingredients the previous day and tried making some sweets, but they had come out looking like charcoal. Akina tried to boost her confidence by saying they probably tasted better than they looked, but when they both took a bite, they agreed it was potent enough to be used as poison. Akina noticed her sister's bummed-out expression, so she decided she would bake some sweets. Kubo watched her sister and copied what she did, so by the time the cookies were done, she had made something presentable. Akina took a bite of Kubo's cookies and told her they tasted nice. Later that night, Kubo came back down to thank her sister for helping her, but Akina, in her usual fashion, teased her sister for having a crush. The next day of school, Shiraishi breezed through the school like an NPC as he searched for the perfect place to eat lunch. When he finally settled down to eat outside, Kubo appeared beside him and sat down to eat with him. Shiraishi asked why she wasn't eating with her friends, and she told him they both had prior arrangements. When he opened his lunchbox, Kubo couldn't help but stare at his perfectly arranged box, so he asked if she wanted to taste it. Kubo happily suggested they make a trade before trying to feed him a rolled omelette, but Shiraishi moved away from her and took the food from her hand instead, which made her pout like a child. He then held up an omelette for her to take, but unlike him, she ate it from his hands, surprising him. When he took a bite of the omelette he'd taken from her, he was surprised by how good it tasted, which made Kubo brag about how she'd made it herself even though Akina had once designated her a cooking hazard. She then told him she would make lunch for the both of them to share one day. Later that day, Kubo went to a cafe with her friends Tama and Hazuki. When Tama asked if she had a crush because she was glowing, Hazuki pointed out that Kubo was still too much of a child to understand what that meant. Tama then realized Kubo hadn't gotten her first kiss yet and tried to give it to her until Hazuki pulled her back. Hazuki also asked Kubo if there was someone she was interested in, and she admitted she had her eyes on Shiraishi. Tama couldn't hide her disappointment and asked how Kubo could be interested in someone like Shiraishi, while pointing out that he was ugly, unathletic, and in the running for the dumbest character ever created. Kubo came to his defense, saying there was more to him. She also admitted she didn't like it when others badmouthed him because he was a good guy, so Tama started crying and apologized for calling him names. When Hazuki asked Kubo to tell them more about her precious Shiraishi, she refused, causing them to tease her for being overprotective. They then asked what she'd do if she saw another girl speaking to him, and Kubo went quiet, making it crystal clear she was falling for the guy, but hadn't figured it out yet, so they decided to see how everything played out. The next day, Shiraishi arrived at school a bit early and decided to enjoy the peace, but his hopes were dashed when Kubo spoke up from where she was sitting. He noticed she had been listening to music and apologized for disturbing her, but Kubo told him it was fine and asked him to move a bit so they could listen together. When the song was over, she told him to play something from his playlist, causing him to back away, and told her he only had songs from anime and video games, but Kubo assured him that she didn't mind. When they started listening to the song, he told her it was from the anime adaptation of the manga he had given to her. As soon as Kubo mentioned she liked the manga, his inner weed came out, and he started talking about all the things he loved in the series, while she watched him with a smile on her face. Later that day, Kubo was very engrossed in the anime Shiraishi had told her about, and she ignored Akina's taunts and jabs. Meanwhile, at Shiraishi's house, he had just finished reading a manga when he looked at the calendar and realized it was almost white day. So he decided to go to the sweet shop and buy some chocolate to give to the person who had given him the cookie on Valentine's Day. When he got to school the next day, he had no clue how to go about it, so he told Kubo he wanted to talk in private. Outside, he was behaving awkwardly, so Kubo asked him what he wanted to say. He gave her the sweets and said he wanted to give them to someone, making Kubo feel bad because she believed he had a crush on another girl. Shiraishi then explained that he felt obligated to return the gift to the person who gave him the cookie, and since she seemed to know the person's identity, he wanted her to give it to them. Kubo then asked how many sweets he'd received on Valentine's Day, and he told her just one. She seemed pleased with the information and told him they didn't have to leave the classroom to do this because he was so insignificant that the other students wouldn't notice what he was doing. She then said she thought he would ask her out on a date when he said he wanted to speak with her, and this made Shiraishi so surprised that he started glitching like an underpowered robot. Kubo laughed and said it was a joke, because she knew he was too much of a coward to try and put moves on her, so she wanted to get a rise out of teasing him. Before they headed to class, he asked her to tell him the identity of the person who gave him the chocolate, and she gave him a vague answer, leaving Shiraishi stunned because he was too dim-witted to understand her. Days later, while walking home, Shiraishi dropped his handkerchief, so a little girl picked it up and came to give it to him. Shiraishi thanked her, but was surprised she was able to take note of him. As he wondered why she looked familiar, Akina came to stand beside the girl. When she saw him, she immediately referred to him as the plot viewer before asking if Kubo returned his ID. Shiraishi remembered Kubo telling him her sister had given her the ID, and that's when his Windows Explorer brain put two and two together. Akina introduced herself as Akina Kubo and the little girl as Seki Kubo, her cousin, before revealing that Saki admired Kubo so much that she was letting her hair grow out like Kubo's. She showed him a picture of Kubo in middle school, and Seki asked if he thought she would be as cute as Kubo when she grew up. Shiraishi didn't want to answer, but Akina told him not to crush her spirit, so he replied shyly, saying she would. Akina teased him, saying he was an awkward kid if a little girl had him shaking like a leaf. She then offered him the picture as a reward and exchanged pine contacts with him. Later that night, at Shiraishi's house, he was having dinner with his family when his mother threatened to take his games away if he failed his finals. The next day, while Shiraishi was studying in the library, Kubo crept up on him, so he asked why she was following him around like an obsessed fan. She told him she'd come to return a book, but noticed the books in front of him and offered to help him with the ones he found difficult. Kubo gave him no room to refuse before going to borrow glasses from a friend so she could look the part of a teacher. Suddenly, Shiraishi wondered if she would tease him for not being smart, and considered telling her to forget about helping him. However, he weighed his opinions and realized that he'd rather be teased by Kubo than have his games taken away. When she sat beside him, she explained how to solve the question he was struggling with. Shiraishi was surprised she didn't tease him, and when Kubo noticed his behavior, she guessed that he thought she was going to tease him for being stupid and dumb, which he denied, but Kubo saw through his bullshit and told him that she'd never mock someone for trying to study. After their study session, Shiraishi was glad he'd allowed Kubo to tutor him because she was a good teacher. They then made plans to meet up the next day and study together, but Shiraishi fell sick and had to skip school. In school, no one noticed he was absent until their teacher announced it in class. When school ended, Kubo stayed behind and tried to text Shiraishi but was unsure what to say. Eventually, she sent a text asking if he'd be at school the next day, and he texted back saying he would. However, Sita came into his room at that moment and tried to get his brother to play with him, and as they struggled for the phone, Sita accidentally sent an "I miss you" sticker to Kubo. Kubo was about to respond to the text when he texted her, explaining that Sita had been the one to send it. So she decided to play with him and sent one saying "lonely without you." Shiraishi was surprised, but she sent another, saying her sister had been the one to send it. The next day, Shiraishi arrived late and contemplated whether to go to the class and join the lesson. Just as he decided to play hooky, Kubo came out of the classroom and nearly fell on top of him. He asked if she was okay, but she said she felt a bit feverish, so she was on her way to the nurse's office. Shiraishi asked why she was going alone, and she explained that the class was taking a test, so no one could go with her. As she began walking away, Shiraishi stopped her and offered to go with her, because he was afraid she might fall down the stairs. When they got to the nurse's office, no one was around, so he helped her to the bed and covered her up. The nurse soon arrived, and Shiraishi explained the situation to her, so she thanked him and told him to return to class, which he did. Shiraishi was glad that he was able to pass his finals and not get his game confiscated, so when he saw Kubo, he thanked her for tutoring him. While it was raining outside, Kubo was glad that she brought her umbrella and asked Shiraishi if he brought his, but he told her that the weather report didn't say it was going to rain until evening, so he didn't bring an umbrella along. Kubo saw this as a chance to share an umbrella with him so that she could experiment to see if other people would notice him as he shared an umbrella with her, but Shiraishi refused and decided he'd wait a little before going. Kubo pouts because he didn't accept her offer, so she lent him her umbrella and said she'd run home, but Shiraishi didn't let her and ended up sharing the umbrella with her. On their way, Shiraishi was nervous because he thought Kubo planned to share the umbrella like a couple. He tried to think of a way to escape the situation without getting seen by other people and decided that they both take a different path with fewer pedestrians. When they reached a zebra crossing, Kubo was disappointed because no one had seen them and asked Shiraishi if he'd intentionally made them take a lonely path so he could develop plot with her. Shiraishi blushed because his intentions had been misread, but Kubo teased him a bit until they got home. The next day, while Shiraishi was taking a stroll, he saw Saki struggling with some bags, so he went to lend a hand, but she refused because she wanted to be praised by Kubo for being able to carry all the heavy bags. Shiraishi noticed the strain the bags had put on her hands and let her know that even though Kubo praised her, she'd also worry. He told her that if she let him help her, he'd tell Kubo that she was the one who carried all the bags, and Seki agreed on the condition that he gave the bags back when they got close to Kubo's house. Shiraishi lifted the bags and found out that they were heavier than they looked and asked if she was running an errand. Seki told him that she wanted to make lunch for Kubo because she learned how to make potatoes and meat stew, but she was worried that she wasn't going to be able to make it since she didn't buy all the ingredients. So Shiraishi told her he'd message Kubo to find out if they had the remaining items at home. Meanwhile, Kubo was panicking that Seki was late and decided to go look for her when she received Shiraishi's message and wondered why he'd sent such a message but replied to him nonetheless. She soon came across Suki and Shiraishi and thanked him for helping Saki. The next day at school, Shiraishi undid his cloaking jutsu as he sneezed, drawing attention to himself. He also found himself in a bind as he had misplaced the spring for his ball pen at a crucial time in class. Kubo then gave him one of her pens, which looked a little too cute for comfort, but Shiraishi accepted the thoughtful gift. Later that evening, Kubo, Tama, and Hazuki had a sleepover, where they celebrated the fact they were done with the first year, but it dawned on them that they would be changing classes and might not be together. Kubo's thoughts went to Shiraishi, and she felt sad since she might not get to be in his class, but when Tama asked about it, she denied it. Soon enough, Tama fell asleep on the bed, so Kubo and Hazuki took the futon, but when Tama woke in the middle of the night, she joined her friends. Days later, Shiraishi's mother asked him to go to the supermarket to buy some things for her, and Sita insisted on coming along. Meanwhile, Akina, Kubo, and Seki were on their way to buy some things they needed for their picnic. Akina suggested they make the food themselves, and when Saki asked if Kubo would help her cook, Akina said that unless she was ready to eat poisonous dark matter, she should give up. Seki told Kubo that she would be glad to do all the cooking as long as Kubo enjoyed the food. When they got to the store, Kubo noticed Shiraishi and excused herself, but Seki made sure she followed her. When Sita noticed Kubo, he said hello to her, while Shiraishi tried not to freak out by how close they were. Suddenly, Seki appeared beside them, making the two separate before Shiraishi introduced an awestruck Sita to her. Sita got shy and went to hide behind his brother, but Saki approached the little boy and introduced herself to him. Just then, they noticed Akina watching them like a creep, and like always, she teased them before asking Shiraishi what his plans for the next day were, and when he told her he had nothing planned, she extended an invitation to join their picnic. The next day, when Saki arrived at Kubo's house, Akina informed her that Kubo was trying to cook. Seki then went in to help her so they could work faster, but when she noticed how Kubo handled a knife, she realized she was completely kitchen Sakura. When Kubo accidentally cut her finger, Seki took over and prepared the entire meal with Kubo as her assistant. And when they were done, Kubo thanked Saki for saving everyone from eating her toxic brew. Later in the park, they met up with Shiraishi and Sita before finding a place to sit for their picnic. Akina fed Sita and told him Seki made all the food, making the little boy burst with happiness. While they ate, Akina, who was drunk from all the beer she consumed, started teasing Shiraishi and accidentally flashed him her massive jugs, causing Kubo to get angry and walk away. Shiraishi went after her and tried to apologize, but she said he wasn't to blame and started walking away. Before she could get far, Sita pulled on her dress and pointed at a depressed-looking Shiraishi before begging her to make up with him. So Kubo went back to him and apologized for making him feel bad. Shiraishi admitted that because of how dense he was, he had no idea why she was mad at him. But Kubo suddenly changed the subject. As they walked hand in hand with Sita, Kubo asked Shiraishi if he'd like to be in the same class with her during the new school year, causing him to freak out. The new school year had just begun, and Shiraishi, Kubo, Tama, and Hazuki were all in the same class. While they sat, their teacher asked for volunteers for the environmental committee, but none of the students wanted to join the committee because they hated the manual labor that came with it. Kubo asked Shiraishi if he wanted to join, but he said he wasn't sure. She then pointed out that he was on the committee during the last school year and said that his flower bed was considered one of the 7 wonders of the school because it had no weeds in bloom without anyone taking care of it, even though Shiraishi had taken care of it every day. Kubo smiled before raising her hand and volunteering for the committee, so their chibi-sized teacher walked up to her and thanked her before asking if anyone else, preferably a boy, wanted to join the committee. Kubo then called out to him and said Shiraishi had been raising his hand, making the short Einstein clone run up to him and apologize for not noticing him. When he walked away, Shiraishi looked at Kubo, who was smiling and wondered what the cunning fox of a girl was up to. He then asked why she wanted to join, so Kubo told him she wanted to learn from him and turned away. Sometime during the day, some male students were talking about how Shiraishi joined the environmental committee because Kubo joined. When they asked Sudo, another student, what he thought of it, he told them he believed Shiraishi joined because he liked working on the committee. As they teased Sudo for being a human herbicide, they didn't take note of Shiraishi looking at them. Kubo interrupted Shiraishi by asking if he was wondering how someone took notice of his work, and at this point, he was convinced Kubo was a mind-reading witch because she'd guessed what he was thinking. She then asked if he'd spoken to Sudo before, and when he said no, she bid him farewell before heading to the next class. On his way to the first science class of the year, Shiraishi wondered who would be in his group and prayed they would be people he could cope with. Surprisingly, Kubo and Sudo ended up being in his group, and as the class began, he noticed Sudo trying to find an eraser. Shiraishi guessed that Sudo didn't bring his, but didn't know how to offer him one of his erasers. Kubo noticed his situation and loudly asked Shiraishi to give her one of his erasers. When Sudo noticed the 5 erasers, he laughed and asked Shiraishi to lend him one as he'd forgotten to bring his. He then told Shiraishi that he'd been meaning to ask how he managed to keep his flowers alive, but never got the chance to because he never saw him during the last school year. After the class, while walking with Kubo, Shiraishi thanked her for helping him out with Sudo, and admitted he liked being able to enjoy a conversation with someone other than her. Kubo suddenly stopped and told him to go ahead because she needed to do something. When she left him, she went to hide behind a wall as she blushed because his admission had caught her off guard. Later on, Shiraishi stopped at a vending machine to get a drink. When he noticed a new flavor of his favorite drink, he tried to buy it. But Kubo suddenly showed up and scared him, causing him to pick water instead. Although she apologized, Shiraishi knew the sly girl didn't mean a word about it. As they walked, she asked what drink he'd compare his life to. So Shiraishi thought about it and said his life was like water, causing Kubo to laugh before adding that he had the right to be any drink he wanted. After a while, she asked what sort of life a person would have to be considered a lemon flavor, and Shiraishi said they would have to live a life completely different from his. Kubo added that one needed friends to at least have a social life, making Shiraishi blend into the background like a chameleon. When she asked what the problem was, he said he couldn't aim for such a life because he didn't have friends. Kubo asked if he didn't see her as a friend, and the slow-witted moron foolishly asked if they were friends. When Kubo started pouting, he apologized and asked if she saw him as a friend, and Kubo told him she already thought of him as a friend, making him walk away with a smile. The next day, Kubo approached Shiraishi and suggested they do a staring contest. While doing it, he tried making funny faces, but she let him know that their contest didn't end when someone laughed, but when someone looked away. She then smiled and said she'd never had the chance to look at him for that long, causing him to look away. Kubo was happy she won and said he had to greet her first the next day. Later in the day, while Shiraishi had his head outside the window enjoying the cool spring air, 2 male students dusted the chalkboard erasers out their window, causing the wind to blow all the chalk dust in Shiraishi's face. They didn't notice him until he coughed and apologized immediately. Shiraishi went to clean up the chalk dust, and Kubo appeared behind him, asking if he needed her help removing it. He tried telling her he could handle it, but she got closer and wiped the dust from his hair, causing his heart to beat faster. She then told him his hair was thicker than she thought and asked him to feel hers, which he hesitated to do. But Kubo urged him to give it a try, which he did. She turned around and asked what kind of hairstyles he liked on girls, so he told her that as long as it suited the girl, he liked it. Kubo wasn't satisfied with his answers, so she asked what hairstyle suited her the most and began listing them out for him. So he shyly told her she'd look nice in a ponytail and awkwardly walked away from her. After he left, Kubo wondered if she'd wear a ponytail to school the next day. Later in class, the teacher announced that their physical test would take place the next day and told them to be prepared. After he left, Shiraishi was tucking in his chair as he wondered if he had grown taller in the past year. Just then, Kubo came to stand beside him, and he immediately thought she was going to say exactly what he was thinking, but she surprised him by asking if he'd grown taller. Kubo asked why he was surprised by her question, and he admitted that aside from his family, no one had ever pointed out that he had grown taller, so it was a surprise she had noticed. Kubo then placed her hands on her chest and asked if he thought she had grown bigger, causing Shiraishi to look at her plotless chest. Not wanting to say something stupid, he looked away and asked if she was still growing taller, to which she said yes. She then took him to the staircase and suggested they compare heights by standing next to a wall and using a ruler to measure their heights. After she did him, she told him to hold up the ruler while she moved into his former position. But the moment she stood before him, Shiraishi couldn't help but think about how much he liked their height difference. Kubo noticed his expression and asked what the problem was, but moved back apologizing. Before he could move far, she held onto his shirt, saying if she didn't hold him, he'd run away, and the dude actually proved her point, because the moment she let go of him, he bolted outside. While trying to catch his breath, he realized he had taken her ruler in his haste and decided to return it the next day. Meanwhile, Kubo was in her feelings because of how close they had been. The next day, Kubo had just sat on the bench she usually waited for her friends when Shiraishi approached her and greeted her. Kubo was surprised until she remembered the deal they had made the previous day. He then handed her ruler back to her and bid her farewell before heading to school. Before they went in for their physical exam, Kubo told Shiraishi to give her his tracksuit jacket so they could finally conclude who was taller. He tried to refuse, but she insisted, and when she put it on, she was swimming in it. She sat down on her chair and pulled her knees to her chest, saying he was taller. But he wasn't paying attention to her words because he was distracted by her thighs that were exposed. He quickly turned away so he wouldn't look like a creep. But when he turned around, Kubo had disappeared, only for her to call out to him from the window saying the physical exams were about to start. In the gym, Tama told her friends she was worried she had gained some weight and admitted she hadn't eaten that morning. When Kubo asked how she planned to survive until lunch, Tama pointed out that she wasn't like Kubo, who could eat without worrying about adding weight. Kubo argued that she couldn't put on weight in the areas she wanted, and her friends quickly concluded that she was referring to her non-existent plots. Tama noticed her jacket was bigger, and Kubo lied that she was wearing her sister's old jacket. Just then, two girls passed by, and Kubo overheard the shorter one and asked the taller one if she was putting on her boyfriend's jacket. The taller one said she was because she liked how it smelled like him, causing Kubo to smell Shiraishi's jacket secretly. Days later, Akina met Shiraishi on the road as he was monitoring Saita, who was on his first errand. She pointed out that he didn't need to be sneaky about it because he was practically invisible, but he said he had to. Akina asked if it was because they were related, so he explained that if he spent a lot of time around a person, they developed a resistance to his invisibility. They continued following Sita until he bought the eggs he was asked to buy, and as they waited for him to return, Akina suddenly looked worried. But when Shiraishi asked what the problem was, they were interrupted by Sita, who just arrived. Akina hugged the little boy, telling him how proud she was that he completed his first errand. She then told them the story of Kubo's first errand and how she had come home crying after she tripped and broke the eggs. Akina said she had to stroke her head until she calmed down and asked Shiraishi to do the same if she ever cried in front of him. When she got home that evening, she told Kubo about Saita and reminded her of her first errand, so Kubo started sulking, and Akina had to stroke her head to calm her down. When she mentioned that it would be 10 times better to have her crush do it for her, Kubo became quiet, making Akina ask who she'd thought of, but Kubo ignored her. Days later, Shiraishi was reading the announcement for the release of the movie adaptation of his favorite manga, when Kubo interrupted him. Shiraishi jumped out of his seat, and when she asked why he'd been lost in thought, he told her about the movie, so she suggested they go see it together, shocking him. On the day of the movie date, Shiraishi and Kubo took the subway, but it was so crowded that Shiraishi had to use his body to protect Kubo from getting crushed. Kubo felt bad because people kept bumping into him since they couldn't see him. When they got off the train, 3 guys approached Kubo, asking her to hang out with them, while they completely ignored Shiraishi. When he noticed Kubo getting uncomfortable, he tried to think of the best way to step in and save her. In the end, he just moved closer to her and spoke out, which made the guys ask where in the spirit realm he'd come out from. Shiraishi told them he'd been there the entire time they tried putting moves on Kubo, and they called him a liar, One of the boys asked if they were dating, and just as the dumbass Shiraishi was about to say no, Kubo grabbed his hand and said he was her boyfriend. The boys were shocked, to say the least, but backed away as they told Shiraishi they were rooting for him. After the guys left, Kubo thanked him and admitted she was a bit scared. By the time they got to the mall, they realized that all the good seats were already taken, and Kubo suggested they wait for the next one, saying she didn't mind going home late because it meant she could spend more time with him. To kill time, they decided to explore the mall, and the first place they went to was a cafe. When Shiraishi ordered coffee, Kubo told him that he sounded so manly and mature, and said she would order the same thing. He asked if she had ever drank coffee before, and she admitted she hasn't, so Shiraishi tried to convince her to buy juice, but when she started pouting, he gave in and ordered the drinks. He tried getting sugar and cream, but when she noticed he was taking his black, she said she would do the same. Unfortunately, she hated the taste and took a sip of his own, only to discover they were the same thing. Shiraishi felt bad about her first experience with coffee, so he went to get sugar and cream for both of them. They then went to the arcade before heading to a clothing store. While they were there, Kubo noticed the movie was about to start, so they rushed to the cinema. When they finished the movie, Kubo told Shiraishi that his facial expressions changed during the movie, which didn't happen often, so he explained that he tried not to smile in school because he was worried that when someone eventually noticed him, it would be when he was smiling to himself. Shiraishi said he didn't want to be known as the creep who smiled at himself, but Kubo told him it was fine because no matter what expression he wore, she could always read him like a book. Later that night, after he walked her home, Kubo asked if he'd like to hang out with her again, and he told her that he would, so the two promised to do so before Shiraishi walked home. The following day, when classes had ended, Shiraishi and Kubo were the only ones left, so she used the opportunity to ask if he tuned in to the awesome mental game show that aired the previous night. He told her he didn't, and this made her propose taking the test together. She then browsed the internet for the website, where she began reading out some questions, the first being how he'd scream if he had a bad dream. He just said he'd probably scream with a funny face, which had her laughing. For the next question, she asked how many blooming flowers he could picture in his mind, and he said 1. He noticed she was surprised and probably thought he answered the question wrongly, but Kubo had to explain that she was surprised because his answer meant he'd only date one person in his lifetime. This had our man kind of confused, as a part of him was glad he would finally pull a baddie, while another part of him thought his negative rise and invisibility curse might prevent him from meeting the one for him. That meant he'd only get one chance. Next, Kubo asked him to read some questions so she could also answer, and this made Shiraishi screw around until he found a question asking the number of cats playing in a room. While Shiraishi could only see one, Kubo, the one-eyed cat woman, said she saw a lot. When they checked the interpretation of their answer, they were shocked to find out it was the number of kids they'd give birth to. This had Kubo dying of embarrassment, so she quickly made up an excuse to make herself scarce, like an anime better than Naruto. A few days later, Kubo found Akina making coffee and asked for some as expected. Akina told her to stick with straw juice since she was still a kid, but Kubo argued that she had already drank coffee before, so it wasn't her first time. Akina had to ask when such a thing happened, and when Kubo said it was a very long time ago, she tried to recall the day since it was a special day her sister allowed her to braid her hair for practice. She recalled doing an outfit check for Kubo after putting on a weird outfit, and she was also curious to know why Kubo was suddenly more conscious rather than her bold everything-goes personality. Back in reality, she remarked how glad she was that Kubo was becoming a woman. However, she felt left behind since she no longer adored her. Kubo then assured her that she loved free things, so she'd forever be her baby sister, just to get things from her. As they conversed, Kubo smartly took her cup of coffee to her room to enjoy. The following day in class, Shiraishi was daydreaming about food and his stomach cooperated by growling so loudly that people noticed him for the first time that day. Kubo immediately teased him for breaking his invisibility curse with his loud stomach that had everyone staring at him. She then offered him a chocolate bar, which he took, but noticed a birthday message written on it. He had to ask how she knew his birthday, so she explained that she saw it on his ID card, that one time she was supposed to return it. She proceeded to give him another chocolate with another message prompting him to check inside his desk, which he immediately did and noticed a small gift wrap. She gave him the go-ahead to open it, which he did only to find a pink figurine that had him mute for some seconds. This made her think he didn't like it, but he thanked her from his heart before asking for her birthday. Kubo told him her birthday and made sure to ask if he'd get her a present, but he told her not to get her hopes up too much. She then promised to give him gifts every year regardless of him reciprocating it, and this made him reveal that only his family usually bothered to gift him on his birthdays, so he was happy. As he walked home that afternoon, he wondered why Kubo wasn't affected by his invisibility curse, and coincidentally, Kubo was watching him and recalling the first time she noticed him. She saw him first in Tama's middle school yearbook, and even Tama knew him as the Invisible Kid. Truly, when they began high school together, Kubo noticed that Tama wasn't capping as he was totally unnoticeable by his peers. It was always fun to watch him when they eventually noticed his presence, so when he was made her seat partner, she talked to him. As expected, his reaction was so priceless that she decided to make it a habit of teasing him every day.